Hi, I'm Phoebe from Breaking Light Productions, and recently I made this little centaur by customizing a couple of Monster High dolls, and I just wanted to show you a little bit about my process of how I made her. So let's get started. So here are my base dolls that I'm going to be using for this project. A couple of G1 Monster High Ghoulias, who I love because of their mean expressions and their dead gray skin tones. This is the one I'm going to be using for the front half of the Centaur. I'm not sure which model of Ghoulia she is. I actually tried to look it up and couldn't really figure it out, except that I notice, if you look in here, she has elastics for joints, which I think are a feature only of the very early Monster High dolls, so she might be from the very first release. But she's pretty and her joints are in good condition, so that's why I picked her to be the face of the project, so to speak. And in order to match her, I specifically looked for another Ghoulia. And I think, as you can see from the different makeup, she's a different model. Again, not sure which one. Though, unlike the other Ghoulia, she has the plastic joints that the later models tended to have. But the important bit about her is that she came missing an arm. I specifically looked for a broken Ghoulia so I wouldn't destroy an intact doll when I made the back end of the Centaur. Well, I think on the whole I prefer G3 of the Monster High line better because I think they have a little bit more character and personality to their designs. There's always going to be a part of me with a soft spot for those, nasty model faces and those creepily thin bodies with their really excessive sway back. Actually, that part I don't miss at all, really. We'll address that later in the process. So the plan for assembling the doll, following after Requiem Art Designs, is to cut off the top half of the broken Ghoulia and attach her back half to the backside of the upright Ghoulia. So her back will become the horse body and her legs will become the horse's hind legs. I'm also going to turn all 4 feet into hooves by sculpting over them with clay and making the heels into the fetlocks. Then I'm going to reverse the direction of the rear knee joint in the way that a horse's rear knees would be by rotating the calf backwards in the socket and carving away the spur of plastic on the knee, which turns out is the only thing that keeps it from bending in that direction. That also means I need to cut off the hind feet and reattach them facing the other way so that the fetlock will still be going in the right direction. Again, all credit to Requiem Art Designs, who was even good enough to explain how that knee reversal process worked when I asked. Also of note, it was when I was making this demonstration that Bernie first referred to this as my human dollipede, which if that has to be in my head, it has to be in yours too. Next step is to remove the doll's head, and I'm doing that by softening it up the vinyl with a hairdryer. Then I take my heat glove and I pull it off in stages so that I don't break the plastic neck peg that's inside, which is responsible for the articulation of the head. And so I'm going to do it in 2 steps. I get it over the first sort of little ridge there, then I heat it back up again and give it another tug, doing my best to be gentle. And now we have the very old, probably very stressed little piece of plastic, yet still unbroken. And now our job is to clean this head off so that we can alter it. Now I'm reaching inside the head with a pair of forceps to pull out sort of all the chains of hair plugs that are glued to the inside of the head so that there's no more little stubble sticking out. And then I take some acetone on a piece of paper towel to wipe the face off. And as much as I like Ghoulia's mean face, off it has to come. Then you can take a look at the face mold without the makeup. As much as I love the Monster High design, really does emphasize the sexy baby quality that they have. Now I am planning where to make the cut on the second Ghoulia body. I'm drawing lines on it to give myself a guide, and I ended up trying various things to do it. My first attempt to crack sort of into the shoulder socket was just using a pair of jewelry cutters or pliers, snips, I don't know what you'd call them. But then I eventually broke out the big guns and just got a handsaw. I was smart enough to use hand protection because this was a bit of a struggle. And eventually I got impatient and I just cracked the whole top of her off. I'll find a use for her loose head eventually. Right now she's currently disembodied, but modeling a very charming demon skull war helmet. Now just putting the pieces together to see if they're still lining up the way I imagined, and I think it's looking pretty good. Now the next challenge will be to find a way to join them without losing the articulation of either of the dolls. So if you look inside the body, you can see that it's mostly hollow, which means that if I'm going to get enough surface area to really bind them together, I'm going to have to fill that with something. Like many of my doll customizing foremothers, I'm inclined to use an armature wire. So I have to give something for that armature wire to be embedded in the back end if I'm going to be able to plug that into the front end. The other thing I'm thinking about now is how to make sure that the back legs are in the right position, and they can't currently bend backwards because of the little plastic spur on the knee joint back there. So that's going to have to come off. I decided to use a box cutter to just sort of shave that down. Again, I was very, very smart and remembered to put work gloves on the hand that is in the blade's way. And as you can see, without it, it will bend freely backwards, which makes for a nice little equine haunch. Then it was time to fill the cavity, so I would have something to embed the armature wire into. And this ended up being more of a pain than I thought it was going to be. I started by just cramming as much random bits of trash I could get into there, like little pieces of used sandpaper, until there was something to stick the wire into, and then I started sticking down more paper around the wire to give it more stability. But when I started drizzling the glue in, I forgot about the fact that the doll is not really sealed at the bottom, seeing as there's, holes for the joints of the legs to fit into. So after I had filled it with glue and then let it dry, I realized that I'd kind of frozen the legs. So I had to kind of very carefully crack that glue apart so that the joints could still move. And honestly, I don't know if I actually got enough glue in the right places to hold the wire where I wanted it to, but, well, it didn't seem to be moving around too much, so I decided to go with it. Then I decided to move on to altering the feet, because in the rear they were pointed in the wrong direction now once I turned the leg around, for the heel to serve as the horse's ankle bone. So I am going to have to cut those off and reattach them. So just like with the body, I drew a little guideline right above the ankle on both of the feet. I went with the box cutter again to get it started, just to make a little bit of a groove in it. Forgot my hand protection this time, so do as I say, not as I do. But at least I remembered it when I bust the big saw back out to finish the removal. And here's where I started to get concerned about confusing them, because left and right are not my strong suit, as anyone who's ever worked with me will know. So I checked to make sure I had them on the right sides before I reattached them. So my plan here was to also use armature wires. I was going to use a little bit of the wire brad that I cut off to reattach them firmly, because I didn't trust glue or clay alone. So I put the tiniest drill bit that I had into my drill and very gingerly screwed into the leg. It peeled off this very perfect little curlicue of discarded plastic as it made the hole. And that actually worked pretty well. I was worried that I might drill out the side if I wasn't careful, but I'm pleased to report that it went in straight. Then I put a few drops of the super glue in the hole on both sides, before inserting the wire again. Then I did the same thing to the feet, which again I had to be very, very careful. Look at it spin. But I also managed to not puncture all the way through those either. It was at this point I discovered that there's actually left and right markings on them. Although I have to kind of put them backwards to make them work properly in the opposite orientation. And then I put some super glue on this side too and stuck them onto the wire. Now they won't push all the way down because again they're not reattached to the place where they were cut from, so it's not going to be a perfect fit, but I tried to get them as close as I could. And then I got paranoid and tried to fill the gaps with as much glue as I could possibly coax into the cracks. Now it is time to bust out the epoxy sculpt, which is a really cool substance that I wasn't aware of until I started watching doll customization videos. It is a two-part epoxy clay, which means that it doesn't activate and begin to dry until the two separate media are combined. And that will, start a chemical reaction that will solidify into a stone kind of texture that you don't have to fire in an oven, which is really useful for doll customization because you're working with plastic. So I was excited to sort of try this out for the first time. This project is really the first time that I've ever done more than just mess around with it a little bit. So I used that to fill in the gap left by the cutting process on those ankles. And my goal is to get it as smooth as I possibly can by, pushing it in and rubbing away the excess. And then you can even use a little bit of water to smooth it out. And the idea is that it'll sort of blend in seamlessly with the plastic because it sticks to it really well, and you can smooth and shape it with tools after it's dried. So after I gave it 24 hours to cure, I did just that. I went in with the razor blade and sanded it down and tried to get it as smooth as possible. Then it was time to turn these feet into hooves, and I'm going to use more epoxy sculpt for that. As I mentioned, I just wanted the horse's ankle to sort of be the heel of the Monster High doll, and then just build the hoof right on top of that by using those same techniques of just smoothing it on. I tapped it against the mat so it would have a nice flat bottom to stand on later. Then when I've got those on, I go and make the same things for the front feet. Again, I'm trying to make them all as identical as possible, using a little bit of water to smooth them seamlessly into the doll's leg. I'm not the best sculptor by any means, but I have worked with clay, for a long time, and I know the gist of what you're supposed to do with it, even if my knowledge base probably exceeds the skill of my hands. And I check them all four together to see if they look like a reasonably matched set. I think they're coming out okay. Of course, we want them to be sisters, not twins, as you would have on any natural creature. Again, once they're dry, you can kind of shape them a little bit more. I'm using a round file and the box cutter to sort of make that curved place on the fetlock between the ankle bone and the hoof. And then I'm going in with another layer of clay to sort of make the distinct hoof shape. That's a good strategy when working with epoxy sculpts. You kind of make the base shape generally, and then you go in once it's dry with some more details. And the last detail I want to get on there is that sense of the fur kind of growing down over the hoof. And again, once it's dry, it's got to be sanded like crazy, which every craftsperson knows what a pain sanding is and just how much of crafting is frequently sanding. But it's really necessary here if it's going to look seamless with the plastic. Sand, 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 sanding forever, sanding till I die. I even sand the bottom. Again, I want those hoof bottoms to be flat so that the doll has a chance of actually standing. And I keep going back to check to make sure that they're all kind of still even, still symmetrical, still matching up the way I want them to. I think it's coming along. At this point, I've decided that I'm gonna fix up the elastics on the front Ghoulia because they're a little bit loose and worn out, and that's the danger of using elastics, that they don't last forever, but the advantage of them is when they do wear out, they're fairly easy to replace, which I've done on a couple of dolls at this point, so I kind of know what I'm doing. Basically, you just need a thin elastic that you can weave in and out of the hip joint and through the joints at the top of the legs. And it's a little bit tricky to get in those tiny spaces. I'm using my clay sculpting tool to help. But once you've got them all restrung, you've just got to tie them together really tightly so that there's some tension enough to hold a pose. And then you just clip off the excess and it's as good as new. The plastic joints are probably superior overall, but when they break, they're not replaceable. So testing it out, that looks pretty good. I think I'm happy with that. Now it is time to reattach the head. And again, I'm going to soften it up using this hairdryer. I think I bought this thing for $12 10 years ago. And it's terrible, and it's caused many a circuit to blow in homes I have lived in, but, you know, still serving me all this time later, so it's good enough to get the head back on. Now I am going to give her some hair, and I got this thick acrylic yarn for free out of a giveaway box set in Aresia. It's not very nice or anything, but for some reason I kind of like the color and texture, and I thought it would go good with the gray skin tone. So I've been cutting lengths and I have been unraveling them. It's a 3-ply yarn and it makes this really nice crimpy texture, which I've always thought was really beautiful in hair. I wish I had hair with a wave like this. And I thought its sort of big, coarse waves would be perfect for a horsey character. So I'm going to use it on her head and to make a tail on the back end. So this is my rerouting tool. I got it from the Doll Planet. It is basically like, you know, a graspy little handle, like some people make them out of drill chucks, with a needle that has a cut eye. And what you do is you take a strand of doll hair, at least when you're using yarn like this, you take a strand and you hook it through the broken eye, like so. And as you probably observed earlier, the doll's head is covered with holes from its original hair. So you just stick the needle in through the holes, and this hair is a really big, thick fiber, so it'll kind of catch in that tight little space. And then you've got some hair. And this takes forever. You have to do a lot of them, but since I'm using such a big, coarse fiber, I don't need nearly as many in the head as I would if I were using something finer, where you have to take, like, you know, 25 strands at a time to do each plug and make it have any kind of density at all. But the way I learned from the great Delightful, whose YouTube channel I highly recommend because her work is great, you kind of go in a circle, in a spiral towards the crown, getting fuller and fuller as you go. Now I'm kind of tying off the sections that I've made so I can evaluate how the hair is laying and see where it needs filling in and where it's full enough for my purposes. You don't necessarily want to plug every hole if it's making the hair too dense and not useful for the hairstyle you're going for. And I've got a little right-hand side part. Imagine that. Are you surprised? And this is telling me that I'm pretty good in the front and sides, but the back still needs a lot of filling in. I haven't totally decided on a hairstyle. Probably nothing very complicated because I'm not exactly great at hairstyling. It's like my one great gap when it comes to costumery and related arts. But I do know I kind of want it to lay down in some kind of a fall. Maybe I'll put some braids or little adornments in here or there, but I think I mostly want it to be coming down her back, which means that the back needs to be fuller. And there's her full head of hair. I really like how it came out. It's really soft, and I just love this texture. And as you can see, she's got some gaps here and there, but I think that it lays the way I want it to lay, and as long as I've styled it correctly, those gaps shouldn't be visible. And it won't be too bulky for me to get the effect I want. And again, I don't know what I'm doing with it yet, but, I started playing around a bit to see what I might like. Maybe I'll take these two sections and pull them back from the face and do a little braid or something with some adornments and then leave the rest down. I'm just checking to see if there's any of the bald spots showing, but I think that would work if that's what I decide to go with. And here I'm taking a spare piece of plastic to wrap up her hair and keep it out of the way. This will keep it from getting messed up as I work on other things, and it'll protect it from like all the glue and paint and other substances that are to come. I take a little bit of acetone and just make sure that there's none of my hand oils left on her face, because now it is time to do the face up. And this part is important and tricky, so I'm a little bit nervous. The first thing I need to do is primer, and the absolute best substance for this, bar none, everybody agrees, is Mr. Super Clear, which is expensive and toxic to the point where you have to wear PPE when you do it, and you absolutely are not supposed to spray it indoors. So I had to venture out of my cave in order to do this next part.
Okay, there's the turkey. There's the other turkey.
See the conditions I'm working under? No henning. She wants to steal my doll. Stay away. A safe distance and don't steal my doll. Okay. Don't know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna give it a try. Check it out. I don't want to poison the turkey. I guess that's right. What do you think? Does she look okay to you? Absolutely plotting to steal this doll. Unfortunately, I gotta leave her out here so she can off-gas outside of the house. Okay, then you're drying that. Okay.
Look behind you.
I don't know what to do. You stay there, and you stay over there.
Well, she looks okay so far, as I nervously peer out the window. But I know Turkey is lurking nearby. You okay out there? You doing all right? Any turkeys capture you? Well, I successfully defended my doll from being stolen by the turkey, which meant it was time to move on to the face-up. Here I am laying up my materials for it, including these Sharpies that I specifically bought because I thought they might help me with the fine line work, until I learned that you're not supposed to use anything oil-based on a vinyl doll head, so didn't get to use that cheat. Oh well. Here I've wrapped the doll in an old rag and put on some cotton gloves to protect her from my hands during the process. The first thing I'm going to do is add some dimension to her plastic skin by using these chalk pastels. And I'm going to just grind a little bit onto my plate here so that I can pick them up on a brush. I feel like that's the easiest way. Start with gray, black, and white, obviously, given her skin tone, but then I use some warmer browns just to give a little bit more life to her. She's not supposed to be a zombie anymore, after all. Then I'm going to take this fluffy brush that came in a pack specifically for miniature painting, and I'm going to use that to blush the doll, as they say. And similar to the theory of how one contours one's face when doing one's makeup, that is sort of how I'm going to apply light and shadow. Visually, the darker places will recede and the lighter places will seem higher and closer to your eye. Not that Ghoulia with these fabulous cheekbones needs a ton of help, but I would like her to be a little bit more dimensional and lifelike. And as I apply the colors with the brushes, I'm also going to soften the lines and decrease the saturation when needed by using a kneaded eraser and also the cotton gloves that I'm wearing. Now come in the watercolor pencils, sharpened to very fine points in the hopes of making fine lines, which is something I've been kind of dreading. My manual dexterity may not quite be high enough to make things as delicate as they need to be on doll face scale. That's why I was hoping to maybe use the fine tip Sharpies, because they have a built-in fine line. The expression that I'm going for is something a little bit aloof and mysterious, like she knows something she's not quite saying, and I'm pretty new at this. I am definitely not an expert, so my reach may exceed my grasp, but I'm hoping to convey that with, the tilt of the eyelids and sort of turning the expression into a sort of sly smile. And that means at some point I'm going to be working with the molding of the face, like the defined eye and lip designs in the plastic, and sometimes that means I'm going to be working against them, like Monster High dolls do not smile, because that's not very ferocious, is it? So I'm going to try to use those definitions to help me where I can to sort of make my shapes better and more symmetrical and all that. And in other places I'm going to have to sort of tweak them to make it fit the expression that I'm imagining. Decided to go with very saturated brown eyes to sort of go along with the equine vibe. And I want her human self to be mostly human, but a little bit horsey. While I couldn't use the Sharpies, I did find these acrylic paint pens, and I got the finest tip that I could in hopes that that would sort of stand in for the teeny tiny brush strokes I didn't quite trust myself to make. And I found I enjoyed using them. They didn't quite make up for my own lack of skill, but they did make things a little bit easier, and I used them to go over the template that I'd drawn in the watercolor pencil. And in combination together, they were more dimensional than they would have been on their own. The only downsides were that I think if I could have found an even finer tip, I would have preferred that, and I was a bit limited in what colors I would have access to if I was relying on the pens. So I probably need to just bite the bullet and practice my fine detail work with teeny tiny brushes. I also painted in some eyebrows. I don't know why, I've always enjoyed drawing eyebrows and making the hair like stroke motions. Finally, I did introduce some acrylic paint on brushes, mostly because I needed more color variation than I could get with the paint pens. It was particularly necessary to get some saturation on the lip color. I decided late in the process to give her some white freckles using both the paint pen and the watercolor pencil, because I wanted her horse body to be a dapple gray, and I thought that would coordinate really nicely. And as a very final touch, I decided that those pure white eyebrows weren't going to work, so I pulled some fibers loose from the yarn that I used for the hair, and using super glue, I glued those on top to give her three-dimensional hair eyebrows that actually matched her hair color. And here is her finished face. I'm actually pretty happy with this. I'm very much a newbie, and it's perhaps not as sophisticated as I would like it to be, but I think there's something of the expression I was intending there, and I think it's not bad for an early try. Next step is to attach the two halves of her body. I didn't want to paint the face with, handling the big horse body attached and, have to worry about breaking it or something. But that does mean I need to be careful now of not messing up the face while I'm finishing the construction of the body. And to do the attaching, I have to drill a hole in the front doll so that I can insert the wire that we embedded into the back doll earlier in the process. Now I'm being very careful to drill in the right place so that the bodies line up the way I want them to. Then I fit them together to do the initial test. And actually that's looking pretty good. It looks like her feet end up about level on the floor, and the human body meeting the horse body is creating the right profile. Unfortunately, the hair wrap is blocking what I'm doing here, but now I am putting super glue onto the wire and into the hole to make an initial connection between the two pieces. Then after it dried, I decided, since I had the drill out anyway, I would make another hole to insert a wire for the tail to go onto. Now, time for more sculpting. I have mixed up some more epoxy, and I am putting on the first pass of it to just create a firm connection between those pieces and to bulk up the shape of the horse body. I need to be careful as I do this that I don't seal the joints up with the clay, so to maintain the articulation, I, rotate them back and forth to make sure that they have enough space for when the clay cures around them. Once it dries, I'm going to do the second pass of clay, and I want to bulk up the very, very skinny Monster High body a bit and change some of the shape issues I have with it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the few things I really didn't like about the original Monster High dolls was that their sway back was always kind of creepily excessive to me. And amusingly, that's an issue that horses can have as well, but I would like to fix that for our doll here. So I am going to raise the profile of the spine a little bit to make her look a little bit less lordotic. I rode horses when I was growing up, and I remember one that I was always fond of who had a fairly extreme case of sway back, and in horses it's not necessarily a health issue, but it kind of looked a little sad. So I think I'll spare our girl here that. Also using the clay to embed the wire for the tail. And as much as I tried to smooth everything out using water in the sculpting process, I can still see a fair bit of my fingerprints and lumpy bits, so back to sanding. Then once she's sanded, it's time to paint her, because we want it to look like all of the modifications are just, smooth, continuous pieces of the doll, so I made my best effort to color match the plastic in hopes that it would all seem smooth and seamless. But even if it wasn't smooth and seamless, I was planning on making her a dapple gray horse, and thankfully the paint job on that should conceal any deficiencies in my sculpting. So I dry brushed a darker gray all over her body, getting a little heavier and darker on the legs, as that's a common feature of this color of horse. And I added the white dapples, mostly on her hindquarters and back. Then I finish off her paint with a dark dorsal stripe and 4 white sock markings on her feet. Once that dries, she gets 2 quick coats of varnish to protect the paint from chipping off. I use the matte kind, and I cut it with water by about 50% because I don't want it to dry shiny. Ooh, we're getting close now, just a few more things left to go. Next, I think I'm going to attach her tail to the little wire brad that I embedded in her hindquarters. I take the same yarn that I used to make her hair, and I measure it, and I untwist a few strands of it. Then I take a needle and thread and bind it about halfway across so as to make a little bundle. And I decided I wanted to use some silver beads as hair adornments, so I go through my little stash of them and pick one out to kind of act as a ponytail holder to cover the transition between the body and the tail. And as best as I can, I pull the bundle of hair into the bead using the thread. Wow, I really like how that looks. Then I glue it to the wire in the hindquarters using a touch of super glue. Now, as for clothes, as a Centaur, she didn't need a lot of them, but I did think she needed some. Since her design was pretty monochrome, I thought this would be a good way to get some color in there. So I picked some various shades of pink embroidery thread because that looked good on a doll with gray skin. And my plan was to weave them into some kind of halter top. And I figured if I made a long enough woven strand, I could sort of shape it to my purposes. I decided to call upon my, childhood skill of friendship bracelet making and wove 4 strands of the pink thread together, which was fun at first but became tedious very quickly. But then when I sort of looked at what I'd made on her, I didn't really like it and wasn't quite sure that it was going to do what I was imagining. So I abandoned the colored friendship bracelet idea and, surprise, surprise, ended up staying with a narrow palette of neutrals. Imagine that. So at this point, I was getting a little impatient to finish, and I didn't really want to look up a pattern, so I just cut some scraps of fabric and messed around with them on the doll until I got something that I liked. I ended up twisting a little bandeau in the middle and then tying it behind her and securing it with a stitch. Then I twisted a little bit more of the fabric and looped it around her neck as like a halter strap. Nothing fancy and definitely hacked together. But I kind of like the naturalistic, unfinished vibe of, clothes handmade by a creature that's mostly wild. So I think it works. And at last it was time to free her hair from its plastic prison. At this point I hadn't seen it in quite a while, so it was a refreshing change. I decided to go with the half up, half down style I was envisioning from the beginning, along with a few hair adornments. So I got more of the silver beads, and using the same technique that I used to put the ponytail on one, I looped some thread around the strands and then pulled them onto the beads, weaving some strands in and out of more than one. I installed a couple more at the back at the base of the ponytail. Then I used my meager braiding skills to braid the rest of it. I'm not even good at braiding my own hair, so this came out better than usual. I'm actually really happy how it came out, given how woefully bad at hairstyling I am. It looks wild and magical. I even put a few in her tail. And finally, 2 silver beads got put onto curved wires to serve as earrings, as the very last touch. And there we have her, my very first complete doll customization project. I've decided to call her Breeze, as I think that suits a horsey girl who's the color of a storm cloud. I did go back and forth through the process on whether or not I wanted to give her horsey ears and get rid of her human ones. I think I was kind of thinking of her as having a really clear separation between her horse side and her human side, but the gray skin kind of necessitated all of her being pretty horsey. Maybe I should have used a different doll for the front end, rather than 2 Ghoulias if I wanted to do that. Well, there's an idea if I ever want to make another Centaur. I do know my face-up skills have quite a long way to go until they're as refined as I would like them to be, but I am actually pretty damn happy with her, especially considering how much body modification a project like this requires. I thought I did okay on the sculpting, and I really love how the hair came out. I don't know what made me want to do something this challenging for my first try, but I'm really glad that I did. I really enjoyed this process, and I don't think she's half bad. So there you have it. I hope you found it interesting to take a look into that process. I'm hoping to make some more dolls in the future, so stay tuned. In the meantime, thanks for hanging out with me and good luck on your own projects.